This program is brought to you by the Practicing Law Institute, a nonprofit learning organization dedicated to keeping attorneys, professionals, and accountants at the forefront of knowledge and expertise.
Hello and welcome to the Insecurities Podcast, keeping it fresh and staying wonky on the latest securities, regulatory, and enforcement developments with a practitioner's perspective on the stories you should be following. As always, I'm Chris Eckhoff, and I'm here with my co-host, Kurt Wolf.
It's good to be with you, Chris. We are returning today to one of my favorite topics.
Tried and true.
Something we've talked about several times here on the podcast, something that at least I believe our listeners really enjoy hearing about, and that is whistleblowing and the SEC's whistleblower program. Of course, we've talked about this on a few episodes relating to the SEC Speaks conference, relating to the Securities Enforcement Forum, the annual Securities Enforcement Report. Our good buddy George Wilson usually talks to us a little bit about whistleblowers and includes it in the SECI's quarterly update newsletters. And then we've had a few dedicated episodes. If we go back, Jane Norberg, episode 47. Of course, she used to run the SEC's whistleblower program. Tom Mueller, who was a New York Times bestselling author, who's written extensively about whistleblowers and their process. And I think some of the plight that whistleblowers experience when they're thinking about or actually blowing the whistle. That was episode 26. And then, man, if we go way back, Chris, do you remember what our first one was?
I think it was like episode 3 or 4 with Matt Stock.
Yeah, it was 6.
Oh, 6.
Episode
Okay.
6. Yeah. Matt Stock from Zuckerman Law,
That's
who
right.
represents whistleblowers. And that one, I have to say, it maybe is, I think my kids would say it's like cringy because it's one of our early ones, you know? I think we just
the
said.
topic was good, but the production and
but
the
the
co-hosts
substance
were not.
is quality, right? So Matt was great. Maybe Chris and Kurt were.
Hopefully
but
have
if you go back and you want to understand well the SEC whistleblower program, what the process is for preparing and submitting a tip, that one's still fantastic. I think the nuts and bolts are still largely the same. There have been some changes to the whistleblower program, but I think the nuts and bolts, if you want to understand how it works, are pretty much the same. So, as I said, continues to be something of interest to listeners. The landscape certainly continues to change, I think, for whistleblowers and those who represent them in terms of the rules. So, we wanted to dive into the world of whistleblowing again on this episode.
And I really like kind of the take that we'll talk about today. You'll hear a little bit about some of the scholarship we'll discuss today with our esteemed guest. Happy to give a brief bio. I'm sure we could spend a lot of time talking about his past. Alex Platt is an associate professor at the University of Kansas School of Law, where he teaches securities regulation, as well as other courses. Alex Scholarship has appeared in leading law journals such as the Stanford Law Review and the Yale Journal on Regulation. He's been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, and other outlets, and notably cited by several SEC commissioners. Kurt, I don't know if our podcast has risen to that level yet, but hopefully with Alex being on here, maybe someday we'll be cited too. Alex, welcome to Insecurities.
Well, thanks so much for having me on. I'm a longtime listener and fan of the program.
Love to hear it.
Yeah, I'm so glad you could join us. And Chris, I'm going to site check you on that one because I actually do think we have been footnoted in a commissioner's speech. But I'll get back to you on that.
Play the party music. Anyways.
Anyway, so Alex, great to have you. You've written a paper relatively recently or done some research relatively recently that looks at how some things are taking shape on the whistleblower landscape. But before we get into your more recent work, we want to just take a step back and talk about government whistleblower programs generally, and thinking specifically about the ones that were created under the Dodd-Frank Act. Of course, Dodd-Frank was signed into law back in July 2010. And among the many things it did, it required the SEC and the CFTC to create and administer whistleblower programs that provide whistleblowers with certain protections and awards. We're really going to focus on the SEC today, although the CFTC's program is really very similar. The rules are very similar to what we see at the SEC. So you can tell me later, Alex, if the trends you've spotted are similar with respect to the CFTC. Just as a reminder for our listeners out there, the SEC's whistleblower program provides monetary awards to eligible individuals who come forward with high quality original information that leads to a commission enforcement action in which over $1 million in sanctions is ordered. And the range for a whistleblower who ticks those boxes is somewhere between 10 and 30% of the money the SEC actually collects. There's a lot of other wrinkles. We won't go into them now, but that's the basic. You come with original information, they bring an enforcement action in which $1 million is ordered, and you may be eligible for a whistleblower award. Alex, a couple of years ago, you completed some research and penned an article entitled The Whistleblower Industrial Complex. And in the article, you argued that the success of the SEC and CFTC whistleblower programs depends on the agency's ability or capacity, really, to sift through just an avalanche of tips. And that has only increased since you wrote the article, right? So there's a lot for them to get through. But you say the tip sifting process has really been shrouded in secrecy. And your article explored the critical role that whistleblower attorneys play in the process. So tell us a little bit about the research you did on the whistleblower industrial complex and how these whistleblower attorneys really shape or play into the process.
So the whistleblower programs created by Dodd-Frank might be, I think, the single most universally praised securities regulation program of the 21st century.
Yeah.
And yet, we don't really know how those programs work. So last year, for instance, the SEC received about 18,000 tips and issued 68 awards. So the mystery to me is how on earth do a few dozen SEC staffers manage to sift through that mountain of tips to find the really good ones? And the success of the program really depends on the quality of that screening process. So if the agency's picking the wrong tips, they might be missing the next Enron or next Madoff. So for all the praise lavished on these programs, we know remarkably little about how that sifting actually works. And so for me, that's the main question. How does the SEC actually go about screening that mountain of tips? And the answer, the main answer is it doesn't. More precisely, the SEC has effectively outsourced or privatized this core tip screening function to different groups of private actors outside of the agency. So my first project, the one you mentioned, looks at the whistleblower bar, that is the private attorneys who represent tipsters before the agency. Now, everyone knows about the revolving door, right? The revolving door between the SEC and the defense bar. We all know about that. But around 2020, I started noticing that this revolving door was revolving in a new way between the SEC and the whistleblower. I got curious about that. And so under the Freedom of Information Act, I was eventually able to get from both SEC and CFTC a list of all of the attorneys who'd represented successful tipsters in the agency's whistleblower programs. And that data proved to be very eye-opening. So first, although both agencies say you can be a whistleblower on your own, most of the successful tipsters were actually represented by a lawyer, and the average award was much higher for ones who were represented by a lawyer than the ones who went at it pro se on their own. Second, not all lawyers are equal in these programs. So both the SEC and CFTC programs turn out to be dominated by a concentrated group of law firms and lawyers. So at the CFTC, it was particularly extreme. A single law firm accounted for about 2/3 of all the dollars paid out by that program. And last, but definitely not least, a small group of revolving door attorneys, that is, attorneys who used to work at the SEC and now are in private whistleblower practice, are just doing exceptionally well in the whistleblower program. I found that their clients of these revolving door attorneys won as much as 40% of the dollars paid out by the SEC in the most recent period I studied. So those are the main findings from that paper.
Yeah, it's a fascinating finding. I mean, look, I represent whistleblowers from time to time. I don't think I'm on your list of the concentrated folks, but it is sort of, we've talked about it on the podcast before. There was almost this little cottage industry that started cropping up around whistleblowers immediately after the rules were finalized and the program kicked into gear. But it seems like the number of folks who do it well, the number of folks who represent whistleblowers well, it is actually maybe decreasing, or at least a small number. And this was sort of the concept that was picked up by the Wall Street Journal shortly after your article ran. The Journal penned a piece that really focused on this finding that the awards were going to whistleblowers who were represented by a disproportionately small number of, the quote is, well-connected repeat players, which refers to the lawyers. They pick up on another point, which is that this may be having a deterrent effect on other potential whistleblowers. So I'd like to understand that a little bit better. I mean, why is it, or how is it that potential whistleblowers feel maybe disincentivized to go forward if they can't get to one of these specialized lawyers? Or explain to me, or help me connect the dots, I guess.
So the data show that these former SEC officials seem to be dominating the whistleblower program. In the paper, I explain why that dominance seems to be the product of special advantages and relationships that those lawyers have, rather than like skill or knowledge that they have. So, for instance, some of the former SEC officials are on the record about the special treatment that they get for their clients by virtue of their status as ex-SEC officials. So that means those lawyers have something no one else has that makes them especially good at their jobs, and that insulates them from competition. So Kurt, even if you're a better lawyer, bigger staff, and even if you're willing to work for half the price, some of the best whistleblower lawyers may not want to hire you because you don't have this thing that some of these former SEC lawyers have, which turns out to matter a lot. What that means is the revolving door attorneys are insulated from competition and can keep the prices high. They can charge a higher contingency fee because they're not subject to that kind of competition, downward pressure. And any economist will tell you if the prices are high, demand will drop. So if you're a tipster out there, you're a vice president at Deutsche Bank, you've got a great tip, you're thinking about whether or not it's worth it to come forward. You might come forward if you think you can keep 90% of your bounty. But if you're going to have to pay 30 or 40% in a contingency fee because of these higher fees, you might choose to stay home. Like you were saying, there's a huge amount of risk and cost to being a whistleblower. You might lose your job. You might have personal, professional consequences of other types. So this is a cost benefit these whistleblowers have to do. And if the price for legal services is too high, we might be losing some high quality tips.
Alex, I'm just remiss that I wasn't able to jump in with a joke about the quality of Kurt's service as an attorney before you kind of talked about the economics of the delivery. But as an accountant, obviously, you can appreciate those differences. And Kurt, I think you're a heck of a lawyer, even though you're not maybe on that concentrated list.
Thanks, buddy. I'll put that on a bumper sticker.
Yeah, that's right.
Good heck of a lawyer.
And I think, Alex, you talk a little bit about kind of the cost of being a whistleblower, right? And it's not just financial. We had a great conversation on our episode with Tom Muller about the book he wrote about the life of a whistleblower post-reporting. And it is not just big checks and a vacation home. It is a tough personal and professional decision. So apart from that increased cost for those attorneys who may be on the inside, it can definitely be a decision to make along the way. But I want to talk a little bit more about some of the things that were happening at the time that the Whistleblower Industrial Complex paper was published. Around that time, the SEC was in the process of considering and adopting its final rules to amend the whistleblower program. The Commissioner Ueda released a dissenting statement on those amendments that cites your article to the extent that the commission wants to improve the whistleblower program and its rules. Quote, it should perhaps consider promoting greater visibility into its claims and award determinations and increasing the number of high-quality tips from unrepresented persons, end quote. To that end, he argued the SEC could, quote, evaluate the role played by lawyers representing whistleblowers on a contingency fee basis and how they present tips to the commission, end quote. Alex, you picked up on this transparency point too in a recent paper called Going Darker, published in the Illinois Law Review. You argued that the SEC whistleblower program's fiscal 22 report was the, quote, least transparent report in agency history, omitting critical information about the program's operations that the SEC had previously disclosed in every single prior annual report since the earliest days of the program, end quote. Your paper opens with a bang, Alex, observing that while Chair Gensler's SEC has, quote, been on a transparency rampage, when it comes to sharing information about its own operations, the commission has been noticeably less enthusiastic, end quote. Alex, talk to us a little bit more about Going Darker and why you think the commission is itself lacking in the transparency department.
So let me take you back to the fall of 22. So these concerns about the harms of excessive secrecy in the whistleblower program seem to be catching on. You have the Wall Street Journal coverage you mentioned. Bloomberg's doing some great reporting on this as well. There are actually some congressional staffers looking into this issue. And as you mentioned, Commissioner Ueda is citing these concerns in a speech. So I'm thinking, surely the SEC is going to take some reasonable steps now to increase the transparency of this program in the hopes of improving it, putting whistleblowers on a level playing field. Boy, was I wrong. In November of 22, the agency released its annual report on the whistleblower program. It releases this report every year. I had been hoping, naively, I guess, that the agency would have responded to these calls for transparency by increasing the number of aggregate level statistics that it would include in this report. So maybe the agency could tell us how many tips were filed by unrepresented tipsters versus represented ones. That's something they've never told anybody. Maybe they could tell us something about what the most successful tips look like. Do they have expert reports attached? Do they have draft litigation filings? There's just a ton of aggregate data like this that the agency could put out there that would be very helpful to potential whistleblowers out there. It would put everybody, like I said, on that even playing field, and it wouldn't come close to compromising whistleblower anonymity. So November comes around, and not only does the report fail to expand the categories of disclosure, it does the opposite. It omits a bunch of useful statistics that the SEC had been disclosing every year until 22. So it really is, I think, the least transparent report in the history of the whistleblower program. So my paper, this Going Dark paper, is my response to that. And I just walk through those 6 categories of statistical information that used to be disclosed every year and are no longer disclosed now, and speculate a bit about what's going on. Why did the agency stop disclosing?
Alex, one of the areas that I think catches a lot of our attention, our listeners, and Kurt, me especially, is that discussion of the new versus existing investigations in that report. You know, kind of talk to us about why that may be a difference in what you studied with Going Darker.
So the SEC issues whistleblower awards both for information that leads to a new investigation and for information that helps with an existing one. Before fiscal 22, every year the agency disclosed the proportion of awards issued to people in each category. That's really helpful. If you're a whistleblower thinking about whether you want to pass something along to the agency or not, you want to know, well, how often are people in my category getting awards? If it's higher, you might be more encouraged to come forward. If it's lower, you might change your mind. So the fact that the agency in 22 stopped disclosing that information just leaves whistleblowers with less useful information at their disposal to know how likely it is they're going to be rewarded for their tip.
So, as you said, the paper Going Darker looks at the fiscal 2022 whistleblower report. That's a couple reports ago. Of course, the commission has released another annual report for fiscal year 2023. I was going to ask, how are they doing? Is it getting any better? But in preparing for this episode, you actually pointed me to a very recent letter from Senator Chuck Grassley. And by recent, I mean April 2024. So very recent. And the letter is to SEC Chair Gary Gensler. And at least Senator Grassley thinks the SEC isn't doing any better from a transparency perspective with regard to the SEC whistleblower program. In the letter, Senator Grassley complains that the SEC hasn't provided, quote, sufficient details, end quote, to Congress about the whistleblower program, even in budget requests, right? So I think the big complaint here is you're asking us for money, potentially more money for a program, but you're not giving us sufficient details about what you're doing. So the senator concludes that increased transparency is required and sort of leans on Chair Gensler to make those details available to the committee or staff. So I guess, where are we on reporting? Maybe not getting any better, but do you have any predictions about where things might be going?
Yeah, well, I think Senator Grassley has been maybe the single most important legislative backer of the whistleblower programs. So the fact that even he is now losing patience with the excessive secrecy here does seem like maybe a turning point. And his letter is really looking for information about staffing levels in the whistleblower program. That is another thing the agency used to disclose at least a little bit of information about in its annual reports. And then in 22, stopped. That stuff just disappeared.
So I sort of have another going darker adjacent question, right? We talked about how you identified a number of things. I think there were maybe 6 categories or so where they used to provide the information and now they don't, right? So we talked about new versus existing investigations as one example. I think you mentioned maybe a couple others. Another area that went from used to report to no longer report is, quote, the proportion of insider and outsider awardees, end quote. That's your quote. And I think what we're talking about there is, how many of the successful whistleblowers were traditional insiders, right? They work at the place on which they're blowing the whistle versus outsiders, right? People who don't have inside information. Maybe they're cobbling together a story from publicly available information, or they're doing some kind of, big data analysis to work out something that they think is a problem. In Going Darker, you suggested that this percentage of internal versus external whistleblowers might be out of balance, or at least not what we would expect, and that the SEC might be hiding something. You observed that, quote, it is possible that the agency's choice to omit some of this data was driven by a desire to hide something specific that would be controversial or embarrassing. For instance, it could be a political problem for the program if too many outsiders, like activist short sellers, are getting awards, or if too few awards are going to individuals who helped the agency detect new frauds, as opposed to assisting with already open investigations, end quote. This concept, right, of this sort of balance between internal and outside whistleblowers brings us to your latest research paper, which is called The Short Seller Enrichment Commission, ? Whistleblowers, Activist Short Sellers, and the New Privatization of Public Enforcement, end quote. And for any listeners that didn't pick up on it there, that is a Short Seller Enrichment Commission, right? We're proposing a new way to think about that acronym. Your research shows that a growing number of corporate outsiders, including short sellers, are receiving SEC whistleblower rewards. And in an interview with Law 360, you said the SEC should reconsider giving money to those who also seek to profit from trading on the tips that they call in. So I guess, first question, what is the evidence you have compiled that short sellers or other outsiders are actually taking home a disproportionate share of SEC whistleblower awards?
So calculating the level of activist short seller participation in the whistleblower program is just extremely challenging. Under the Freedom of Information Act, I was able to learn that the program has paid about a quarter of all dollars to outsider tipsters. And in the most recent years, it's crept up to about 40% of dollars and awards going to outsider tipsters rather than insiders. But unfortunately, there are some sharp limits on what exactly that tells us. So the term outsider is the SEC's term, and it does include activist short sellers, but it also includes other types of outsiders, people who don't work for the firm, don't have any contractual relationship with the firm. Also, some of the people the SEC treats as insiders might have traded on their information or sold their information to others in addition to being whistleblowers. So the fact that 40% of the whistleblower awards are going to outsiders is important, is interesting, but it doesn't fully answer the question. So rather than give up on the question, what I try to do in the paper is gather as much information as I possibly can about activist short participation in the whistleblower program. I look at legal dockets, I look at news reports, I listen to a ton of podcast interviews and have some conversations of my own with industry participants. And in the paper, I walk through a bunch of case studies and anecdotes in detail. I will spare your listeners the pain of that and just give a couple key takeaways. Number one, yes, activist shorts are participating actively and effectively in the whistleblower program. And in some cases, tipsters are receiving both private market compensation from trading and the public bounty compensation from the whistleblower program for the same information. They are double dipping. I also found some other interesting stuff. Activist shorts, when they participate in the whistleblower program, do much more than merely supply a tip for an investigation. They are providing a full service litigation support operation for the SEC. They are helping the SEC actually prosecute these enforcement actions. They're providing draft legal documents. They are providing witness lists. They're doing other kinds of litigation support for the SEC, and the SEC is all too happy to get that help. And another interesting thing I found is that there's an awful lot of collaboration going on out there between the activist shorts and other types of whistleblowers. So in some cases, you get an insider going to an activist short, they work together to put a tip together, they trade on it and supply it to the SEC. In other cases, the activist short is maybe sharing some of the trading profits with a contractor as an incentive to get their help in putting the information together. There's a lot of different variation going on out there, and the activist shorts do seem to be the center of gravity here. They've got the resources, they've got the know-how, they've got the connections with the whistleblower lawyers who are having repeat play kind of relationships with the activist shorts. And so the program does seem to be moving towards the center of gravity of the activist shorts.
So, Alex, I'm trying to think about the way to word this question to you. It's the objective of the whistleblower program is, to me, kind of monolithic, right? Is to create an environment that mitigates the wrongful activity. I'm trying to be general here, right? As done by the SEC or the CFTC, right? The idea being that there are individuals out there who have information that can help us stop bad things from happening or from being reported or misrepresented across all those veins. And it sounds like what you describe, although a little bit tongue in cheek, is a successful playbook to increase the amount of opportunity that the regulators have to limit bad activity. But that tongue in cheek part is someone's almost paying themselves twice or three times over in the way that they kind of structure their analysis or their submission. So I guess just broadly, why do we see this as a problem if we're getting more successful enforcement actions out of this information? And why do you think maybe the SEC should reconsider the way that it treats maybe some of these submissions that are more formally from a short selling group than, kind of what you might think of canonically of a single individual being a whistleblower on their own?
So the problem, I think, is that when the SEC pays a bounty to an activist short, it's more likely that bounty is just a windfall that provides no forward-looking incentive to provide new information. So let me explain. When the SEC pays a whistleblower bounty to an insider tipster, there's just a rock solid case that doing so creates a powerful new incentive to bring forward new information. In many cases, there's just no other way to get the information out. These are cases where knowledge of a fraud is closely held by maybe a few key corporate insiders. No amount of outside surveillance, investigation, detection is going to catch that fraud. You have to pay for it. You have to create that incentive to bring it out. Similarly, insider trading rules make it impossible for the insiders in that case to trade on the information. So they have no private market incentive to bring the information out. If they do that, they will get busted for insider trading. So the only way to bring the information out is a public bounty program like the whistleblower program. That justification, though, it just disappears when we're talking about paying outsiders. If you're an analyst, if you're an activist short seller, and you sniff out some kind of big problem at a public corporation from the outside, well, that means the information was available to other outsiders as well. So when the SEC pays somebody like that for detecting a fraud, they're paying for work that they could have done themselves. The SEC could have caught that fraud if they had been looking. And unlike insiders, outsiders do have the ability and the incentive to bring that information forward to the market. That's what activist short selling is. There's a robust market today for negative information about public companies, and there's no insider trading prohibition so long as the information is derived solely from public sources. So activist shorts and other outsiders are already well incentivized to bring forward that negative information. So then the question is, well, does the prospect of a whistleblower bounty for those outsiders, does it really provide a marginal incentive? Does it cause them to do even more of that fraud detection work than they already were incentivized to do, given the private incentives? And I think no, it doesn't. There's lots of reasons in the paper, but the most compelling evidence here is what the activist shorts are saying themselves. They're on the record saying that the whistleblower program for them is an afterthought. It's not a driver of their behavior. What they do is they prepare their activist short report, the thing that they put up online, but before they put it up, they send it into the SEC as a tip. Why? There's no marginal cost for them to do so. And so it really just is adding a potential win for them at the end of the day. And this makes sense. Getting a whistleblower award is extremely unlikely, as we talked about at the top. 18,000 tips last year, 68 awards. The activist shorts know that, and they know that the prospect of a public bounty is basically not something you can count on. So all of their work is being motivated by the prospect of private market trading profits, I think, and not by the prospect of a public bounty. So when the SEC pays for that, it's a windfall. It's not creating any forward-looking incentive. That information would be brought forward with or without the prospect of a bounty. So why not just not pay the bounty?
So I guess, what do? Do we bifurcate awards based on private activity? Will that just create a third or fourth order effect of having short sellers split their business between SEC tip related short selling and non-SEC tip related short selling? What do you see as the solution to that?
So the moderate solution that I propose in the paper is to add a factor in the SEC's calculation of whistleblower awards. Right now, when the SEC calculates a whistleblower award, they are required to consider whether the tipster received a bounty from another whistleblower program, but they do not have to consider whether the tipster received private profits from that information. So what I'm proposing is fix that asymmetry. At least consider whether the tipster has already received some kind of compensation from the private market for the same information. Not saying you have to rule that person out necessarily, but just factor that in to your calculation, and you might, put downward pressure on the total award. I think it should be part of the calculation that the SEC does when issuing awards.
It's an interesting proposal. And I do think it's sort of a moderate proposal, right? Because there are many factors that the SEC considers. And I guess in these circumstances, let's say you have a short who, even if they submit the same report that's later released publicly, they come in and they're really helpful to the SEC, right? They provide additional information. They sit for an interview. They point the SEC to things that maybe they couldn't have discovered on their own through publicly available information. Maybe that kind of conduct should be rewarded, right? When you look across all the factors versus kind of just lobbing in a report and hoping for a windfall, as you say, sometime down the road. So I think it's a good proposal, Alex, but I guess that's going to require some rulemaking. Are you going to take the pen on that if the SEC calls?
At the end of my paper here, I have a very short draft, a regulatory proposal here. It's like a half a page. So I've already done that work.
Love it.
I have a million follow-up questions, Alex. And one of my favorite games to play is kind of these, I like to call it hypothetical line stepping, right? In terms of how we qualify or disqualify someone. So I imagine a world in which an individual short seller identifies stock A as having an issue. They put up a paper about how bad stock A is. They send in that tip, and then they buy a lot of short selling, take a short position against that stock directly for stock A, right? That would be an example in your proposed moderate solution where that individual whistleblower would have compensated themselves in the private markets, right? They took a short in stock A. They received dollars on that short when the announcement came out. Thereby, that would limit their award, or at least be a consideration in the award from the regulator. Fair to say?
Yes.
So let's now take it another step. Let's say that this short knows that stock A, there's something wrong with stock A. They report it to a regulator. They take a short position, not just in stock A, but in other related stocks.
Oh, no.
Yeah, here we go, Kurt. Maybe
shadow shorting. Come
right?
on.
How do you define in the market, right? Say that this is a industry leader in their group. Maybe it's a new, development of a drug that a lot of other pharmaceutical companies are also participating in. They buy a short in stock A and in stocks B and C, thereby maybe enriching themselves 3 times over. That again would probably be one that they limit themselves from the private market. Now, Alex, imagine a world in which a short puts out a report about stock A, but only buys shorts in stocks B and C, not related to the actual information that they report to the SEC or about specifically stock A, but their shorts are profitable in stocks B and C immediately following the release of their information. Where would they qualify in the moderate solution?
I think what you want is the SEC to have access to this information when it's making the whistleblower award determination.
Mm-hmm.
You want the tipster to come in and say, yeah, I sold my information to this hedge fund. I don't know what they did with it, but I made this much money. Or, yeah, I traded the following 5 stocks in the same industry, and here's my net profit from those trades. SEC, you decide, what to do with that. I think that if we're using public money to try to create positive incentives in the market for detecting and deterring fraud, this seems like a pretty important piece of the puzzle that should be in front of the regulator.
Understood. I'll save you if they go and increase their purchase in, say, an index fund that is positively impacted by their information as well. Again, I love this hypothetical line stepping, Alex. So we'll have to discuss a little bit more of that off the pod to see where we end up.
Fair enough.
All right. Well, Alex, really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for coming on the show. As always, your research is fascinating and I think really does shine a light on aspects of whistleblowing that people aren't thinking about, aren't focusing on, including here on the podcast. We get caught up, as I said earlier, in kind of the nuts and bolts of how does this work. But we haven't had the perspective that you have. So really appreciate you coming on the show to share your research.
Oh, my pleasure. Great to talk to you both. And like I said, I'm a big fan of the show.
Glad to hear it. And those of you looking to follow more of Alex's work, you can check him out at law.ku.edu. There's a good link to all of his publications, both on SSRN and through a variety of other outlets. So, Alex, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Insecurities Podcast. And a special thanks to our guest, Alex Platt of the University of Kansas School of Law. We always love to hear from you, our listeners. Look for us on social media to share your thoughts and comments or topics you'd like us to discuss on future episodes of Insecurity. Please use the hashtag InsecuritiesPod on X or LinkedIn to join the conversation. You can find me at EcomoffCPA.
And I'm at Enforce_update.
Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review Insecurities wherever you listen. Be well, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for listening to Insecurities, a podcast from PLI, the Practicing Law Institute. PLI is a nonprofit provider of authoritative professional services training and continuing education. In an increasingly complex business environment where intricate corporate structures reign, Insecurities can help you make sense of it all. A special thanks goes to the producer of Insecurities, Daniel Peinitz, as well as hosts Chris Ecomoff and Kurt Wolf. For more information about PLI's SEC Institute, or to view hundreds of hours of fresh and relevant on-demand programming covering changes within the securities sector, visit pli.edu/membership and sign up for a privileged membership. These recorded materials are designed for educational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute legal, audit, tax, consulting, business, financial, investment, or other professional advice, and it does not create an attorney-client relationship. Please consult a qualified professional advisor before taking any action based on the information herein. Furthermore, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individual participants. These views are not the views of the hosts or their employers. Users of this podcast may save and use the podcast only for personal or other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without the prior written permission from PLI.